Hi, welcome back again. We're going to talk today about life sentences, the courts, politicians, and the human rights. Now, this may seem a little bit niche, and I suppose it is, but I've referenced it in a couple of videos, and I thought it was probably worth trying to go on and explain it. Stay with me. This does get quite complicated. And if I do have any of my learned friends out there who recognize when I make a mistake, then please do let me know, and I will make that correction. Until that happens, assume that this is this is broadly accurate, but it is very, very complicated. Do try to stay with me. And while we go through this, we do cover a whole range of different ideas, but it's useful. Good, right, enough preamble. Oh, hello, Jason Isaacs, and everybody else while we're at it. So, life sentences of the courts and the Human Rights Act. Now, let's start off by looking at a life sentence. Now, the easiest way to do this, I think, is to look at an example. So, you may remember, I think it was about 2010, we had a tragic murder in Woolwich. Lee Rigby was brutally murdered by two Michaels. The first of whom received a whole life order, and the second received a minimum 45-year life sentence. Now, the whole life orders are very, very rare. As you can see there, we don't have many people, and that's not an exclusive list, there's a few more. But these guys are basically put in jail, and they're going to die there, is the bottom line. Just out of interest, I wonder how many of you remember who Thomas Mayer is. That is relevant in the case of the politics that we're doing. He was the individual who killed Joe Cox a few years ago. So he has been put in jail, and he has been told that he is going to die there, just like these other individuals. Now, the Home Secretary may grant a release in exceptional circumstances, but generally speaking, if you're given a whole life order, you will basically be leaving prison feet first. A life sentence, on the other hand, is that there will be a minimum term in jail. Most, but perhaps not all of your lifespan. So Michael over here, he got a 45-year life sentence. I think he was about 18 when he did this. He was perceived to be the junior partner in this particular crime. So he will basically go to jail for 45 years. After which time, if he's not incurred further offences, and if he hasn't been released earlier on parole, then I think you get parole on that. Someone I'm sure will correct me if I'm wrong. Then he can expect to get out of jail. Michael Adebolajo will not get out of jail except under certain exceptional circumstances, and that is at the discretion of the Home Secretary. Okay, now this whole issue organizes around, or sort of orbits around, the notion of an oubliette. Do you put somebody in jail and throw away the key? An oubliette, you may remember from your more history lessons, or perhaps some of your more gruesome films, is basically a hole into which you drop your enemies and they don't get out. I can barely think of a more abhorrent idea. Yeah, I can. All right, never mind. So this is the question: did the law? The law, by the way, is the the 1990 the Crime Sentences Act of '97. Did this create an oubliette? So could you just drop somebody into jail and forget about them? Because that's pretty barbaric. I think we would agree with that. So just a little bit here on life before the Human Rights Act. Before the Human Rights Act, then the Home Secretary could actually trump the decision of a court. So if a court came in and delivered a sentence that the Home Secretary perceived to be too soft, he could go over the top of that. And this, I believe, is exactly what happened in the case of the killers of James Bulger. But anyway, that changed. And it changed in 2002 when it was found that this was not compatible with the Human Rights Act. So allowing the Home Secretary to get in and interfere with the sentencing of an individual was perceived to be incompatible with the Human Rights Act, and as a result of that, we had a new act, that was the Criminal Justice Act in 2003, which basically said we are going to create this very, very clear matrix that will determine the sentences that judges can impose, and the Home Secretary can't get in there and start sticking a spoon in, which I think we would have to agree is probably a very, very good idea in terms of the independence of the judiciary and the rule of law. The last thing you want to know if you are being tried for something terrible is that the Home Secretary has had a particular kicking in the Daily Mail that day, and so he decides to make an example of you as you're going to trial or after trial, when the judge has said this and the Home Secretary says, actually, no, we don't like that, we're going to really clatter you because I took a kicking in the Daily Mail. Anyway, we're kind of off the subject there, but it's worth talking about that we have the independence of the judiciary, that the Criminal Justice Act established that the Home Secretary could not go around interfering in the process of justice at the sentencing level anyway. If he wants to go down, if exceptional circumstances are met after the sentence, then he has the right to go in and release a prisoner on license. But he can't he can't put somebody in jail for the rest of their life. That needs to be something that's insulated from the political world. Anyway, so we have the Criminal Justice Act of 2003, and the Criminal Justice Act of 2003 laid out the whole life order. So the whole life order said, once you go to jail, we can leave you there until you die. Now, in 2013, this was challenged. So whole life charges were contrary to the ECHR. Now, again, the Human Rights Act, remember, we determined here that the Crime and Sentences Act of 1997 was incompatible with the Human Rights Act. So we have a declaration of incompatibility issued there by the courts, and in response to that, the Parliament comes up with the Criminal Justice Act of 2003. We are now being asked in the European courts, is this Criminal Justice Act compatible with the European Convention on Human Rights? Now, in order for it to get to the European courts, this has already been signed off by the UK courts. So this has gone through the entire UK system, and the UK system has said, yeah, we're happy with this. We don't see there as being a violation here of the Human Rights Act. But of course, the Human Rights Act is, to all intents and purposes, the European Convention on Human Rights. And so when this case went to the European Court of Human Rights, they're not looking at it against the Human Rights Act. They're looking at it against the European Convention on Human Rights, because of course the Human Rights Act is a British law. Shut up, Poppy. Yeah, I know that's how you feel about the European courts. Well, I'm perfectly relaxed about the European courts. Yes, seriously, they're okay. Don't forget, they're not just the European courts. There is a British representative on those European courts. Yes, there is. We'll lose him when they go. But anyway, that's another point. Andrew Vajja. That's it, Andrew Vajja. Michael Vajja. We do have a representative on the ECJ. I can't remember who our representative is on the ECHR. Anyway, the point is that the HRA is not justiciable in the European Court, obviously, because they're not interested in British law, but they can look at it against the ECHR. Our courts looked at the Criminal Justice Act of 2003 and said, we're perfectly happy with that. That fits through that fits through our Human Rights Act. But then it got to the ECHR, the European Court of Human Rights, and they said, no, you can't do this. This is not consistent with the European Convention on Human Rights. So the ECHR arbitrates legislation or evaluates legislation against the ECHR. Sorry, it's kind of confusing, but that's the way it goes. So we get basically our backsides handed back to us by the ECHR, and they say, look, you can't do this, sort it out. So we keep locking people up. This is something that we do from time to time. We will ignore, and there's a degree of lassitude with it, but we ignored the decision from the ECHR, and we kept locking people up without on these whole life tariffs. So in R versus McLaughlin in 2014, the Supreme Court looked at this again. They said, no, we are utterly convinced that the Human Rights Act allows us to pass the Criminal Justice Act, because what we are not doing here and this was the court's argument, simplified massively, but this is the general point, is we are not putting somebody in jail and we are throwing away the key. That's not what we're doing. Because essentially that is what Vintner said. This is what the European court said here, that what you're doing here is you've got a legal oubliette. You're putting somebody in jail and then you're throwing the key away. And in McLaughlin, the UK courts said, we're not throwing the key away. We're not. We're putting them in jail and they're going to die there. However, under exceptional circumstances, this sentence might be commuted or reduced. So we might let them out before they die under certain circumstances. So in other words, we haven't thrown away the key, we've just put it on a very high shelf. So the key still exists. If we need the key, if we urgently need the key, we can go and get the key and we can let this person out. But we're probably not going to do it, but we're reserving the right to let them out. Therefore, this is not an oubliette. We haven't just dropped them into jail for them to rot. And sorry, ECHR, we really do not lock people up and throw away the key. We suggest you have another look at this. So we returned that to the ECHR, and in Hutchison versus the ECHR, they looked at the decisions again and they read the arguments and they said, okay, what you've done is you haven't thrown away the key, you put it on a high shelf, that's fair enough, that's okay. You haven't, therefore you haven't created a legal oubliette. And essentially the ECHR at this point said, no, we were wrong in our initial reasoning. Thanks for pointing out our error. Your legislation stands. So the Criminal Justice Act is valid. The Criminal Justice Act will pass through the ECHR. And you guys go ahead. You enforce the ECJ. We're perfectly happy. The Criminal Justice Act, the ECJA. We're perfectly happy with that. Go ahead. So why does this matter to you? Well, in the first instance, we've got the Criminal Justice Act being passed to ensure that the Home Secretary stays out of the legal process. So that's a good thing. Then we've got the courts seeking to uphold the will of Parliament, both the Human Rights Act and other laws. So the courts are there to ensure that people respect the Human Rights Act and, in this instance, the Criminal Justice Act. But I think the one that you're really, really interested in is probably going to be this one. This is about the relationship between the UK courts and the European courts. Now, there is a hierarchy. A case will go from the to the European Supreme Court, to the European Court of Human Rights or the European Court of Justice from our Supreme Court. So yeah, the European courts do sit on top of the UK courts. But when we are utterly convinced that the European courts have got it wrong, the UK courts have the right to challenge that decision. Now, just in case you're wondering just how that is significant, well, imagine if the High Court in the UK was able to challenge the decisions of the Supreme Court. So in the case of Al Yamamah, in the judicial review on Al Yamamah, the High Court looked at the decision to stop the investigation, and they said that decision was profoundly dodgy. Now, the government appealed. That went up then to the Court of Final Appeal, which at the time was the House of Lords. And the House of Lords, using judicious restraint and deferring to elected representatives, turned around and said, look, we really, really, really don't want to look political here, so we're going to give the benefit of the doubt to the government. At which point you can imagine the High Court going, oh, for goodness sake, it's quite clearly dodgy. How on earth can you come to a different conclusion from us? But they had to suck that up because they haven't got the right of appeal. We can't challenge a higher court decision in the UK. The decision is final. Once it goes from the High Court to the Supreme Court, or as it was in this case, the House of Lords, that's it. You can't, there's no comebacks. You can't claim that one back. But in the EU, we can. In the EU, we can turn around, our courts can turn around to the Court of Final, to the ECHR and say, look, we think you've got it wrong. Please have another look at this. And sometimes they'll say, yeah, we agree. So the relationship between British courts and the EU courts is much more complicated and nuanced than some of the EU detractors might present. Yes, they are a superior court, but when we think they're wrong, we can argue our case, and sometimes they'll agree with us. I hope that makes sense. Like and subscribe. Let me know if you like my essays, if you like these things. If you don't, let me know how I can make them better. And remember that I do offer online tutorials. Just drop me a line through the comments section. Thank you very much. Bye.